Hey everyone, Brayden Brookshier here with another video of Greek grammar and syntax. Today's video is just a brief reminder and hopefully just refresher on tense and aspect of Koine Greek verbs. I want to say that if this is new material to you, I would highly encourage you to study using some of the well-known or well-appreciated Greek grammars of choice, whether using the one by William Mounce or someone else. But please don't let this be your first taste of this material. I prepared this in hopes that this would be review and help solidify and refresh yourself on such material. Hopefully it's said in a way that makes sense and both helps you understand the concepts. Now, as a brief overview, verbal tense has to do with time itself. Tense encodes when the verb occurred, whether it was in past, present, or future. Now, English, as an English speaker myself, English is a tense prominent language. And we need to understand this distinction here because when we're reading Greek, we don't read it the same way we read English. Well, while that might be obvious because the characters look different, the words are different, also the prominence of the language is different. If English is a tense prominent language, we need to remember that Greek is an aspect prominent language. Greek encodes the kind of action rather than the time of action. Now, what is aspect? Well, in Greek, verbal aspect has to do with the author's subjective or personal perspective or viewpoint by which he or she communicates the action or condition of the verb. And that's why really the best way of understanding aspect isn't just to get a single definition on it, it's to remember and to understand the three broad kinds of aspect that are within Biblical Greek. And you're going to find those within the imperfective aspect, the perfective aspect, and the stative aspect, all of which will be briefly reviewed in this video. A quick reminder on tense. I know when we parse verbs, we use tense, voice, mood, and we refer to tense with hopefully, with an aspect prominence in what we recall as far as tense. But what we need to know that tense, when we talk about it as time related, as you would an English speaker, tense as time only occurs in the indicative mood of Greek verbs. Now, that's important. Tense as time only occurs in the indicative mood of Greek verbs. All other Greek moods, whether you're talking the subjunctive, imperative, infinitive, are devoid of conveying the time, but still encode aspect. And so that's why most examples of aspect are easiest to grasp first in the indicative mood, because a Greek verb in the indicative mood will manifest both tense, the verb's location and time, and aspect, the kind of action. But just be aware. That's why when you read an aorist indicative, you can talk about something as something that occurred in the past. It's an event that happened. Whereas when you read an aorist imperative, well, you can't command someone to do something that's already been done. So the aorist, the flavor of the aorist, the aspect of aorist that goes into the imperative is not the same as it goes into the indicative. That's why tense as time only occurs in the indicative mood of Greek verbs. And that is why understanding the aspect of Greek verbs is more important, or I guess you could say takes prominence when you're understanding Greek. And that is why, too, this cannot be understood in isolation, nor does this video address all of those categories. You need to understand each syntactical category or the ranges of meaning in which each tense of verb has for possibilities of exegesis. More videos are coming on that in the future, but hopefully you've been introduced to that already. Now, I created this little chart here, and I encourage you to pause the video if you want to look at it more. I don't want to spend any time on this for this video. Handouts can be also received if you send me an email. But this just goes over the types of indicatives in Greek and shows how the imperfective, perfective, and stative verbs will fit into the categories of either non-past or past time. Now, feel free to stop your video here if you want to look at that more. Otherwise, let's keep on and stay on topic. As a reminder for imperfective aspect, verbs that are encoded by imperfective aspect are described describe the verb as presented as in process or progressive. This process may be incomplete, which is was or is happening. It may be inceptive, which started to happen, or it might be durative. It continued or continues to happen, or other kinds of in-process action. But the point and moral of the story is that the speaker, the writer, the author, when deploying a verb in the imperfective aspect, which will be either your present or imperfect tense verbs in Greek, is going to present to you the verb as it's happening in process. Now, an example in English would be something like I say or I am saying. Well, these would be examples of typical present tense verbs in Greek. Of course, in English to help provide the example. And likewise, I was saying is an example of the imperfect tense in Greek, where it's referring to something that happened in past time, but it's giving you the end process or progressive picture of it. It's not telling you when it was completed. If I was to give another example, if I says to say I was running, I didn't tell you anything about when the action was completed or perfected. I just am telling you about the action as it occurred in process. Let's move on. Perfective aspect. When verbs encoded by perfective aspect are deployed, the action is presented as a simple whole event without describing how the action occurred. Now, to me and other grammarians, I think one of the most helpful visual reminders is to see the perfective aspect as a snapshot of the verbal action. Think about holding the Polaroid picture and saying, hey, look at this image, this happened. Whereas if you were to think of the imperfective aspect again, the imperfective aspect would be like pulling out your phone and showing a video of an event that was happening in progress. Whereas the perfective aspect would be pulling out your phone and showing a picture, a still shot of an event. It's not showing you the progress or process of the event. It's just showing a picture of it. It happened. It has perfective aspect to it. A good way of thinking about this too is if I were to tell you that I went to the store. I just summarized the whole event. I made the event pretty simple. And I gave you a snapshot of it. I went to the store. I didn't tell you I was driving to the store. It took me 10 minutes to find a parking spot. I got this from the store. I got that from the store. No. The whole point is I'm using the verbal action to say I went to the store. It is a simple whole event. It is a snapshot, the perfective aspect. There you go. Now, a quick and simple example of the perfective aspect here, which let me actually correct my material as I go, would be I said or I spoke. These are examples that you would find in your Greek aorist tense verbs. When I said or I spoke, I don't give you any information about how that happened or any description of it. I'm just stating the simple whole fact of the verbal event. Let's keep going. Stative aspect, and my personal favorite to talk more about, more in the future videos, and as you talk about the perfect tense verb. But when verbs are encoded by stative aspect, the action is generally, and I say generally, presented as describing a verbal event along with its ongoing results. It's a present state resulting from a past action. And I repeat that because it's going to be important to remember that. It's a present state resulting from a past action. And the resultive state, the new state of affairs that have come about from a past action are emphasized, although sometimes you can make the case or argue that the text draws more attention to the action itself. But now, when Jesus was in dialogue with the devil in the gospel accounts of Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4, and when he was repeating scripture to the devil, saying something like, it has been said, when he's quoting scripture, he is stating that scripture had been written in the past. It has already been written, but it stands to remain. The relevance, the importance, the significance of it is what is being emphasized, the ongoing results of the authority of scripture to be relevant to what he is about to say. So when we lean on scripture, kind of like how Jesus leaned on scripture in that example, using stative aspect, thinking about the importance of grammar here, and how it informs our theology, we're saying that although scripture was written in ancient past, and in this case, Jesus quoting from the Old Testament, which was older than obviously when he had been upon the earth, he is pulling from the ancient past, but really leaning on the ongoing results, the contemporary importance of it because of it. So stative aspect has a lot of cool flavor, I think, that we can tend to bring out in our interpretation, in our exegesis. Now, as illustrated right here, you can see that stative aspect carries with it a little bit of both flavors. And I use that word choice of flavor intentionally, but with imperfective and perfective aspect. As imperfective aspect, it's kind of carrying with you the ongoing results. Now, you can, of course, argue that depending on what you're talking about, the ongoing results have been somehow completed and are summarized by the stative aspect. Now, with perfective aspect, it talks about an event that has caused results. Now, when Jesus says from the cross tetelestai, which is very famous when he says it is finished, he's talking about the action itself coming to a completion. Jesus' death on the cross produces a state of results, And so you can see how the stative aspect carries with it both sort of flavors. And you'll have to do good interpretation and exegesis to understand how each individual verb is using both of those. Examples of and let me correct this here, the stative aspect, and just to give you one in English, and I really apologize because it is hard to bring out in English in comparison to Greek, where obviously the Greek verb will tell you what it is based on its morphology. Now in English, I would say something like I have spoken as an example of a perfect tense verb. I would because there's a result of state of affairs that have come about by the action. In other words, the action of speaking, whatever I have spoken refers to, has brought forth a resultant state. Now, there's because I have spoken something, there's a way or an expectation I expect things to be. I'm probably emphasizing the state of affairs in light of something I have spoken. Just an English example of that. Now, aspect and narrative discourse. This is something that would, of course, take more time to go into to really appreciate, but it's something just to be reminded of when it comes to understanding aspect. Verbal aspect not only has the grammatical function to it, but also carries a literary function, most notably in, narrative literature. Typically, verbs with perfective aspect, such as your aorist verb, will carry the narrative forward. It'll say things like this happened and that happened, and so on. Whereas verbs with imperfective aspect, your present tense or your imperfect tense, will typically provide background or vividness to the narrative by giving descriptions about characters or events. Now, I think I should also say, as a helpful reminder, to be sure to allow each author to use different literary styles. For example, Luke scarcely uses the historical present in his gospel, whereas the other gospel writers use the historical present frequently as a discourse marker. More will be said on that in a future video. Okay. Now it wouldn't be helpful if we didn't wrap up with a pop quiz, right? So recall the information that we've just walked through. It's important that this information sticks. That is something that you can utilize in your study of Greek. Now, here's the question. Which Greek mood is the only mood that communicates time? Well, if your answer is the indicative mood, you are right. The indicative mood is the only mood in Greek that communicates time. All the other moods do not. They all carry aspect, but in the indicative mood, the Greek verb carries both aspect and time. Now, next question. Fill in the blank. Aspect conveys the blank of verbal action. Now, if you think right away, aspect conveys the kind of verbal action, well, then you're right. That's probably the easiest and most boiled down way of saying it. No matter what Greek grammar you find, they're going to elaborate upon a definition of aspect, but what it will come down to is understanding the kind or condition of verbal action. Now, next question. The imperfective aspect presents the verbal action as blank. Let's think about that. The imperfective aspect presents the verbal action as in process or in progress. That's what I'm looking for here. That you can understand that the imperfective aspect presents the verbal action as somehow in process. And of course, different categories of what that will mean per the verb and how it's deployed. Now, a helpful visual is to see the perfective aspect as a blank of the verbal action. Now, this is a helpful picture, helpful visual. How do we understand the perfective aspect? Well, I think the helpful way is to see it as a snapshot of the verbal action. And last but not least, the stative aspect describes a present state blank from a blank action. Now, the stative aspect describes a present state resulting from a past action. That's something that we I think we did a pretty good job drilling in and reminder. Now, hopefully this was helpful to you. You feel free to subscribe to the channel. I plan on making more videos like this that go along for Greek grammar and syntax helps. If you want any of the handouts or have any questions or suggestions for future videos or want personal Greek tutoring, feel free to email me directly at braydenbrookshier@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram under the same handle at Brayden Brookshier.